listener production.
A warning. This episode contains descriptions of men's violence against women. Please listen with care. Every word leaves a trace. A disgruntled employee's late-night Facebook rant, cryptic messages, riddled with emojis, arranging a drug deal, a threatening letter from a scorned ex. These are more than words to forensic linguist Professor Georgina Hayden. They're crucial clues that can act like a phonetic fingerprint, revealing the identity of the culprit. Because sometimes the key to solving a crime isn't what's said, but how it's said. In this episode, learn how the scientific study of language can help solve crimes and expose the truth. Welcome to Crime Insiders Forensics. For those joining us for the first time, my name's Kathryn Fox. I'm a former GP, crime author and screenwriter. I'm enthralled by forensics and have spent thousands of hours researching for books and screenplays. So I thought, why not turn my research into a podcast? Every week, you'll be joining me in discovering how forensic science is helping solve high-profile crimes in Australia and around the world.
Linguistics is the scientific or systematic study of language. So we're not analysing language from an artistic perspective or a literary perspective, which is one branch of analysis of language, but we're analysing language in terms of its component parts. So we look at sounds and we look at, morphemes, so structures of grammar, syntax, semantics, conversation, structures of conversation. So using that structured and systematic analysis to solve a crime is one part of what forensic linguistics is. And that many people would say that's the narrow definition of forensic linguistics. It's using linguistics to support a criminal investigation. I should also mention it could be a civil investigation. So it might be a court case that revolves around, a dispute over a defamation, for example, or it might be a trademark dispute. But most typically what we see is the use of linguistics to analyse language that has become of interest to the investigators in the course of their investigation of a crime.
It's not handwriting analysis or anything like that when you look at a letter, but it's the choice of words, the spelling of words, the structure of sentences, and patterns of people's language use.
Yeah, and what we're talking about there would be a case involving authorship identification. But there are other things. Of course, we can have speaker identification. So I'm not a phonetician. I mean, I've studied phonetics, but it's not my specialisation. But setting that aside, what I do is typically authorship identification. And in those cases, yes, I'm looking at the words, the phrases, the use of punctuation, and typically how those things hang together in grammatical patterns or syntactic patterns.
Can you give us an example of what sort of case the police would come to you with, or a defence case or whomever would come to you wanting your consultant expertise for court?
So these days, quite often it will be text messages. So where a crime's been committed and there might be a large volume of text messages that are sent from, an anonymous burner phone in the jargon. And so they can't be necessarily, the authorship of those text messages can't be identified through technical means. So they might come to me or someone like me to say, can I match the authorship of these text messages with the suspect in, for example, a drugs case where the text messages are, setting up the transaction, or there's some criminal element in the text messages that make it useful evidence for the police, but they need to pin down the authorship of that. So that would be an example. Or similarly, threatening letters. And in defamation cases too, it's quite common that people come to me where somebody's been making anonymous defamatory or just insulting posts on Facebook. And quite often people come to me asking if I can identify the authorship. And often that doesn't translate into a case of any kind. They just want to know. And I often don't find out what happens in those cases.
Surely with things like setting a meet-up or a drop-off or a delivery, surely there's not a lot of grammar and not a lot of thought that goes into it. It's just factual info or shorthand.
Yeah, so a couple of things there. Definitely a longer text is really important for some kinds of analysis. So the kinds of analysis where you're analysing patterns of syntax, of grammar, you need quite large volumes of text. And I have to say, I get a lot of cases that I turn down, or I just say, I really can't do anything with this material. I could try and do an analysis, but it'll probably be inconclusive, and that's worse than useless in a trial. So in a case like you're talking about, if it was lots of short texts, I probably wouldn't be able to do any kind of syntactic or grammatical analysis there. What I'm probably going to be hoping for is that the author has used some very distinctive word or phrase that ties them to their known text that they've also used in their emails or their other known text. And that doesn't happen very often. So actually, when you say inconsistencies in the punctuation or the spelling or the syntax or sentence structure, that's great for me. I just go for it. Let 1,000 flowers bloom as far as I'm concerned. That definitely is easier for me to analyse. So, please, if you want to avoid ever being detected as an author, you really have to smarten up your punctuation and your grammar.
We did speak on one of our podcasts here. We spoke to an former FBI person who actually looked at he was a technician in the lab. And at that stage, the Unabomber's brother sent a letter into the FBI that the suspected Unabomber had sent to him. And he actually recognised similar phrases that his brother used. And that's why he sent this letter, could my brother be the Unabomber?
So I know the FBI agent Jim Fitzgerald, who has since gone on to do some work around analysing texts, but also doesn't have a linguistic background. And it is more along those lines of looking at some phrases that look similar. One of the problems you've got is it's a bit like finding a shoe print at the crime scene. So let's say if you had the word didn't, and there's a standard way of spelling didn't, D-I-D-N''T. And let's say, for instance, our suspect wrote the word didn't without an apostrophe. And we had that in known documents written by the suspect, signed by the suspect. No doubt this is the suspect's writing. That's how they spell didn't. And then let's say there's an anonymous threatening letter, and it also has the word didn't without an apostrophe. Well, that's very interesting, but it's a bit like finding a size 7 shoe print at the crime scene and the suspect wears a size 7. So do a lot of other people. So something like didn't spelt without an apostrophe. Yes, it's true that that's consistent, but it doesn't really mean anything because millions of other people would do the same thing. So what you're looking for then is words or phrases which are so unusual that the chances of someone else producing those same words or phrases in another document are vanishingly small. And very occasionally I've had cases where that has been the evidence, where in the anonymous letter there's been some, words or phrases which are so wildly idiosyncratic that I can prove by looking at a large volume of language written by millions of different authors that this is very unusual, and to have that appear in both the question document and the suspect's document would suggest it's not a coincidence. They must be the same author.
Given computerisation and artificial intelligence, spell correctors, all of those things, does that inhibit your ability to analyse?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's probably a bit of a crisis on the way for people who are doing what I do, which is a very manual form of analysis. There hasn't, interestingly, you would think that this is something that could be pretty easily automated and that we would have a machine that goes bing and tells us if two authors are the same. Given all that we can do with text analysis and AI and generative text and so on, it's surprising that that doesn't exist. as yet it doesn't. There's a lot you can do, but there's no machine that goes bing. You won't get 100% certainty with any kind of authorship analysis. But absolutely, I agree that the use of autocorrect and automatic writing machines, of course, that is removing the individuality and idiosyncrasies of an author. To be honest with you, Kathy, I'm amazed at how much bad spelling and grammar there really is out there, considering how many tools there are to correct it. It's staggering. And sometimes I wish people, I mean, look, as I say, the idiosyncrasies are what makes my job easier. Having said that, I often have to analyse minutely a text, a piece of writing over and over and over again. And when someone has made, some egregious spelling or grammatical error, it can start to get under your skin, because in addition to being a linguist who believes that, you shouldn't be prescriptive and we just describe how language works, we don't say what people should or shouldn't do, I'm also an academic. And so I have to teach, a standard.
So one question I have is that if someone is writing a threatening letter, do they tend to be that arrogant to ignore spell check and things like that and just plough on with what they're doing?
Yeah, I'm delighted to say that I have still seen some letters written with the old, cut out the letters from a newspaper or a magazine and stick them. Not that recently, but I have seen it. And I've also seen graffiti. So I've been asked to analyse graffiti. So there's no spell check on graffiti, as we all know, having probably wanted to get up there and maybe make a few changes. Little editor wouldn't go astray. But people, because of the nature of it, because they're trying to stay anonymous, they might still use a handwritten letter, and they still get around. And I have, even quite recently, have been asked to analyse handwritten communications. But no, it seems that a lot of people are still able to produce material on a computer that has a very distant relationship to a spell checker.
What about in trying to establish whether it was a male or female author?
Yeah, so that's profiling. So that's taking a text and trying to say, what can we learn about this writer by looking at the text? I typically don't do that. There have been some times when I've been asked to do that. So actually one occasion I was asked to do that was for the Lady Vanishes true crime podcast. So it wasn't in the course of a criminal investigation, but it was in the course of a, true crime podcast-driven investigation. And that was it was sort of profiling. It was that they had some letters and they wanted me to identify whether they thought the letters might have been written under the influence of a coercion or something like that. So I identified some things in that which were linguistically indicative of an influence from another author, but I leave it to a psychologist to determine, or a psychiatrist to determine, whether that is itself an indication of the coercive control relationship that they were trying to establish.
One of the most famous letters of all time, I think, is the John Benet Ramsey ransom note. And there was debate as to whether or not that was written by a female or a male. And one of the things that I remember most about that was the flowery language. And it was presumed more to be from a woman because it was beating around the bush, it was qualifying things, whereas it was imagined that if a man was writing a ransom note, he'd get straight to the point. And there was so much additional non-essential information in this ransom note. Does inclusion or exclusion give you any sort of clues as well?
Yeah, I mean, it can. As I say, with profiling, I think it's really only going to be an investigative tool. It's never going to be evidentiary, because you can't be accurate enough with that. And of course, even with gender, it exists along a spectrum. So, some people might write in a more masculine way, but they might not be men. And some people might write in a more feminine way, but they might not be women. And even identifying, what is more masculine and what is more feminine is based on, some research that has been done and, features have been identified as indirectness is typically associated with more feminine speech, but it's actually more associated with powerlessness. So you find indirectness coming up in any group of people who are typically less powerful because it's a way of mitigating the imposition on the other speaker. So I think those kinds of things, whether something's been left in or left out, similarly would fall into that category of, they're big, broad generalizations about people, where it's what we're trying to do is identify an individual. So I'm not saying it can't be done, but what a linguist would do is simply describe what's there and then probably leave it to a psychologist or a social psychologist to try and identify then what kind of person might use those features.
If you have people who are potentially trying to make themselves more authoritative, more informed, make themselves sound more intelligent, does that give you any clues as well?
So we need to be very careful about attaching intelligence to a target form of writing. It can be an indicator of education, but it's not necessarily an indicator of intelligence. Yeah, I mean, people trying to disguise their writing is really common. I mean, particularly if they're, trying to look as though somebody else has written something. If we're analysing for authorship, then the kinds of things that we're analysing are the kinds of things that people probably don't really take much notice of. So when we're looking at patterns of punctuation, we don't just look at, how many full stops are there or how many exclamation marks are there. We're actually looking at how are those patterned according to the grammatical function that they serve. So it's at a fairly deep layer. I don't think most people are even aware of that when they're writing. So I think that the kinds of ways in which someone might try to adjust their writing to look different, so they might try to look more or less educated, I think the kinds of analysis that I do as a linguist wouldn't really be affected by that too much. But I mean, I guess you might see someone hypercorrecting, so, putting in a whole lot of extra apostrophes because maybe they think, well, that's what is needed here to make this look more authoritative. But I haven't really seen that, I've got to say.
Well, now you have emojis as well. How do you go when people are communicating with imagery and emojis?
Yeah, well, I guess the closest I've had to that was the graffiti, because there was a sort of context to it, as in where it was placed and then graphically the way it was laid out. But I think luckily I'm not usually being asked to rule on meaning. So I can be. I mean, that can be the job of a forensic linguist. And there's been some famous cases about whether a thumbs up was, the acceptance of a contract and whether that was legally binding and so on. So, there are some really interesting cases internationally about the use of emojis and so on. And I think we have to be careful. So giving a thumbs up when somebody sent a contract was an indication that they had accepted the contract. And then that was obviously debated through the courts. But yeah, these things can come up. So be careful.
How do you say it? Do you say it with confidence, or how do you actually rate your belief? How do you quantify the belief that you think this is the same author?
So I just set out the numbers. I just set out the statistics and let the decision be made by the court if that's relevant. But I have had many things said to me in court, some of which were bizarre. I remember being asked about how much Hemingway I'd read at one point in front of a jury. It was a bizarre line of questioning. What typically happens, Kathy, is that the court, they don't understand what linguistics is. And so in my early days, I used to just present my analysis. I didn't give it too much context. I'd just kind of explain what I'd done and, what the results were. But then I'd get into the stand, and even whoever was doing the examination in chief, so I'm there as a witness for the court, but typically one side or the other will have commissioned my evidence. But yeah, I'd be getting the friendly examination, and even that I would be struggling with because they just didn't seem to understand what my evidence was about. And it was often down to whether or not I was eligible as an expert, and even whether linguistics is a defined field of expertise. It doesn't even get to the level of explaining the stats. It's, is linguistics a thing? Which I think Chomsky would be pretty upset if you said it wasn't a thing.
How on earth then is a jury supposed to make head or tails of this?
Interestingly, I've had less problems with, not problems, but I feel like juries understand it better, remembering that the jury's just listening and trying to make sense of what you're saying, whereas the barristers are trying to either get an angle on what you're saying or tear apart what you're saying. And you know, as I say, the barrister who is cross-examining you, if you're an expert, it's much easier for them to go after your expertise than the content of your report. So once you can get to the content of the report, then I feel that juries can understand it quite well. And I had a murder trial in Bendigo, in the Supreme Court in Bendigo, where I felt that, you know, I don't know, you get a vibe, and I felt that I really connected well with the jury, like they could understand what I was trying to explain. That was the Hemingway one, by the way. I don't think they liked the whole Hemingway line of thinking. It was an argument about whether or not Hemingway, the works of Hemingway early works of Hemingway could be distinguished from later works of Hemingway. And what the barrister was trying to suggest was that all authors change over time, and so wasn't this undermining of the idea that this could have been written by the same. And I just straight away said, yes, but Hemingway had an editor. So, you know, you're talking about something that doesn't, that's not relevant to what we're talking about. And then we got into an argument about whether or not Hemingway had an editor. I mean, it was just bonkers. But this is what happens in court. And I think one of the things that really surprised me most about giving evidence in court is, to me, as someone who takes their job very seriously and who is always thinking about the real people that are involved here, I'm always kind of shocked and taken aback at how much of a game it is in court. It's like a game of strategy, and there's a winner and a loser, and then everyone just walks away. And I've even had a barrister who's given me an absolute roasting in cross-examination come up to me afterwards and then say, "Oh, you give good evidence." I'm like, I mean, okay, that's civilised of you to make a polite comment, but also it just feels really weird. You know, they were all smiles and laughs outside the courtroom, and what we were discussing was really serious. You know, it was about an armed robbery, and this was someone's future. You know, they're looking down the barrel of a very serious sentence. And I find that disconcerting, that that's how the courtroom works. And I'm sure the legal profession would have, you know, and of course I work alongside a lot of lawyers in my work as an academic, and I understand it, but it feels weird to me. Whereas juries are ordinary people, right? Juries are people like us. They take it very seriously. And I think that they too are sometimes taken aback by that sort of game playing that can go on in a courtroom. I did get to put someone in their place once when they said to me, "So, Dr. Hayden," and you never get your title used so many times as when you're being cross-examined, and it always gets used with a kind of, you know, dripping antipathy. You know, Professor Hayden. But in this instance, it was earlier in my career. "Dr. Hayden, are you a member of the International Association of Forensic Phoneticians?" And I said, "No." Because I'm a member of the International Association of Forensic Linguists, but I didn't say that. And then they went on for a bit, and then they said, "So has this report been produced in consistent with the principles for forensic reports set out by the International Association of Forensic Phoneticians?" And I said, "I'm sorry, you're asking me if I've produced a report that is consistent with guidelines of an association we've just established I'm not a member of?" She had to stop her questioning at that point.
I think we often think of scientists as being, forensic scientists especially, as being focused on something minute, but you are a person. You're responding to words as well. You're not just analysing them.
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's really important to be conscious of the impact of vicarious trauma when you do work like mine. Another area of work which similarly engages with language at that level and similarly has struggles with vicarious trauma are interpreters and translators. And a lot of my close colleagues are in interpreting and translating and in a legal setting. And similarly, yeah, when you're very close to a text or close to a person's voice describing something quite horrendous, that can be very upsetting. back in the day, I used to do a little bit more of I described earlier about forensic phonetics and speaker identification. This was actually not a speaker identification case, but it was about clarifying some unclear speech. And I was asked to listen to some recorded conversations. The context of it, again, was a murder investigation. And so, it was the voice of someone who'd since passed away. So that it's quite impactful. Yeah.
Do you have anyone you get to speak to or debrief with?
That's a very interesting question, actually, because I've just recently raised that as an issue, as, something that needs more attention in academia. I know that most of the people that I work with are doing work, as I do, on gender-based violence. And unlike, say, social workers or emergency services, we don't typically have people that we debrief with. I know that just about everybody has their own private counsellors that they see, but I actually think that it is a responsibility of our workplaces if we're doing research in this area, just like, it would be appropriate to provide protective eyewear and gloves for someone working in a chemistry lab, that we as academics working in this field need to be provided with, appropriate debriefing, and my workplace has since put that in place. But yeah, it's hugely important. And to anyone out there, including authors, I think if you're working in this area and you're exposing yourself to this, it is important, because otherwise you become inured to it, and I think it can lessen your humanity. So it's okay for it to have an impact, but then you need to manage that impact as well. And I think the other thing that's really important to me is that we're always respectful of the people involved in these cases. Quite often we get materials and it can be very decontextualized, and, we might even be looking at something that, someone else might pick it up and go, oh, haha, look at that, bad spelling, But, these are people's lives. This is something really serious that's happened, and it always needs to be treated respectfully.
You've also done some work, I gather, in a lot of your research is in police interrogations. Have you actually looked at confessions as to whether or not that was the language of the person supposedly confessing?
So that was a very common pursuit for forensic linguists in the early days of forensic linguistics. So when I was just starting out, there were a number of cases. Nowadays, because interviews with suspects are routinely audio recorded, electronically recorded, that is not so much the case, but you can still get it definitely with witness statements. So whether a witness statement, which can be just as important in a trial as the suspect's confession, whether or not that reflects their own language, and I would suggest that almost certainly it doesn't. Witness statements are still by and large written by a police officer who is trying to do two jobs at once. One is to try and make a coherent record of what a witness is saying, and the other is actually interviewing the witness at the same time. And for whatever reason, lack of resources perhaps, we typically don't record interviews with witnesses. So yeah, definitely there we can see some discrepancies. And there's been some really famous cases in the history of forensic linguistics. There were some very famous cases involving, for example, the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4. So these were terrorism cases in the UK that you might remember from those days of the so-called Troubles with Ireland. And there were people who were wrongly accused and wrongly convicted of these bombings, I believe they were. And then it was later overturned. And in those cases, it was around the confessional evidence. And in at least one of those cases, a forensic linguist was involved in that, Malcolm Coulthard, I think.
And what did they conclude?
Yeah, so what they found was that the one thing that really sticks out in my mind was that there was a lot of analysis, but one of the things that they found was this particular construction that is very much a police speak construction, which is the subject, noun phrase, and then the word then. So I then sat down, I then got into the car, whatever, right? And that this is a very institutional phrasing, and that it was not something that the suspect would ever use, and, could be shown that it wasn't consistent with their normal discourse, which was someone who hadn't had a high level of education and didn't typically write in a very formal fashion. So that was one thing that really stuck out to me, and it was in a paper that I cited quite heavily, I think, in my early work.
What happens with witness statements from people who English isn't necessarily their first language? If they're not caught on audio and they're handwritten, how does that work?
So the way it's supposed to work is that the witness is interviewed through the medium of an interpreter. The statement would be written in English, and then the interpreter would do a sight translation. So that's a sort of like an instant translation back into the witness's first language, so a written version, and that would then be given to the witness to read. How it often works is if the person speaks some English, that there'll be no interpreter present and they'll just be asked to kind of do the best they can, and everyone will just do the best they can, and then they'll be asked to sign something which they may not understand. And that is obviously hugely problematic. And there's a real lack of qualified interpreters in the legal system. We all know that. And it's something that absolutely must be addressed in order to provide access to justice for the huge numbers of people in Australia who don't speak English as a first language.
I have a friend who's an interpreter, and one of the things he says is that just because you can speak some words in a language, like conversationally, you're no way qualified to interpret medical information, for example, or legal information, for example. Is that what you're actually talking about in terms of qualified?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And look, we have a problem where, sometimes it's just not practical. It's very difficult to provide qualified interpreters. So, for example, if you've got large groups of people who are, suddenly evacuated from a country, they're seeking asylum and they've come to Australia, they're in the community, they often need to be engaging with the medical, the legal, all kinds of systems for a variety of reasons. Not, I want to stress, because they are committing crimes or anything like that, but because in the nature of their, settling in and so on. So they might come into contact with all of these different services. And they might come from an area where they speak a very specific variety of a language, and there are no qualified interpreters. There haven't been people from that part of the world in Australia before, or in, let's say, Melbourne before. And so you're looking around trying to find someone who can act as an interpreter and, hope to find somebody who is adequately fluent in both languages. And then they can get a sort of a certificate to, they can be qualified on the basis of their experience, but that's not the same as doing a degree.
How do we differ in Australia from what we see on our screens, particularly from the United States? And how can that mislead people who actually don't know what to expect in an Australian police interrogation?
Yeah, well, and it's not just people who don't know what to expect in an Australian police interview, but I teach undergrad students police interviewing or forensic interviewing. So if you study criminology at RMIT, you'll be taught by me, and I will teach the massive forensic interviewing course where the students undertake a mock investigation of a crime and have to practice all their interviewing skills. But in the course of that, I have to spend 1 week. Every year I teach this course, I have to spend a week explaining what the American system of interrogation is and why we don't do that in Australia. And I still get a proportion, maybe 10 or 20% of my students who will write essays that are praising, what is known as the Reid technique or various methods of coercive interrogation that are used and very common in America. So it's definitely had a big impact. The people, they see this stuff on TV and they assume that's how it is. And it's not just the way it's portrayed in dramas either. There's so much material online on, you can go on YouTube and you can watch training videos from the FBI or, all kinds of stuff which is purporting to tell you about, here are some great tricks you can use to get someone to confess. And it's all, not all, but if you don't look carefully, you don't realize that this is based on the very specific system that they use in America, which is known as the 9-step interrogation process. And it's all based on being able to distinguish truth tellers from liars reliably, which I think we all know is not possible. So it's very problematic. And in Australia, we've really followed the UK model, and that's known as the cognitive interviewing or the PEACE model. And what's important about that is that it's recently been identified as a kind of benchmark for best practice internationally by the United Nations. Juan Mendez, who was the special rapporteur for the Anti-Torture Committee, came out and made a declaration saying that or, he set out a set of principles for interviewing, which are really based on the English and Welsh model, which are really about having a narrative base to the interview, asking open questions, giving people an opportunity to tell their own story in their own words, not contaminating the evidence with leading questions and not being coercive. And these principles have been recognised by the UN as the benchmark.
And one last thing, with plagiarism, how does the actual plagiarism detection software work, and does that help you at all?
Yeah, so not really. Plagiarism detection, so plagiarism is detecting when someone has copied something from somebody else. So that's a published work or a work that's available and it's been copied. The software can also identify where it's been sort of mostly copied and maybe a little bit changed. So it can be fairly sophisticated in that way, but it is assuming a replication process. Whereas what I'm looking at is where someone has independently written two completely different things. One is not copied from the other. It's just a question of whether it was the same person who wrote it. In relation to contract cheating, which is where you pay someone to write your essay for you, and then that person later blackmails you for the rest of your life, by the way. So any students listening, watch out for that one. That's what's happening now. Students are being blackmailed by those contract cheaters who go, I know that you cheated on your, third year assignment. I'm going to tell your employer if you don't pay me $10,000.
People may actually find that they're the victims. They're committing one offence, but they may find that they're actually an ongoing victim of an extortion crime.
Yep, and we've been concerned about this for quite a while, and we could see that this was a very likely development, and indeed it has happened. And of course, people are terribly scared about coming forward, as anyone is in the case of when they're being, victimised in that way. People are always worried about what will happen if they report their blackmailer. And, look, we know that students come under pressure for all kinds of reasons and are desperate and want to just get that essay in or whatever. And they might see it as a pretty minor thing. And maybe it is a relatively minor thing. Does it really matter in one case, one essay, whatever, But, you're not even getting, you're paying so much money for your education and you're not even getting the value out of that education yourself. So that seems really sad to me. But B, you're being dishonest, and C, you're putting yourself at the mercy of someone who can very, very easily blackmail you later because, they've got all the material they need and they're anonymous.
Wow, Georgina, this has been so interesting because your work is I think it's really diverse and fascinating. So thank you so much for everything, and thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Crime Insiders Forensics is a listener original production. It's hosted by me, Kathryn Fox, and is produced by Ed Gooden. Sound design and imaging is by Link Kelly.